June 5, 1944. 2,230 hours. RAF Apodary Airfield, Devon, England. The faces blackened with burnt cork, the bodies weighed down with 120 pounds of equipment each. The American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division shuffled toward the C-47 Dakota transports, lined up like massive metal dragonflies in the fading twilight. Staff Sergeant Don Malarkey of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, looked at the equipment strapped to his body. Main parachute, reserve chute, M1 Garand rifle, grenades, ammunition, rations, water, entrenching tool, first aid kit, gas mask. He could barely walk. Around him, 1,900 aircraft engines roared to life across southern England, preparing to carry the largest airborne invasion force in history across the English Channel into occupied France. Lieutenant Richard Winters, recently promoted to company executive officer, moved among his men with forced calm, checking harnesses, offering quiet words. He'd trained these soldiers for 2 years, transforming civilians into warriors through grueling exercises at Toccoa, parachute school at Fort Benning, and advanced training in England. Now they faced the ultimate test. The mission briefing had been clear. Secure the 4 causeway exits behind Utah Beach, destroy German artillery positions, capture key bridges, and hold until the seaborne invasion forces pushed inland. Simple on paper. Winters knew better. Nothing in combat ever went according to plan. Across the airfield at RAF Cottesmore, Colonel James Gavin, 37 years old and the youngest general officer in the U.S. Army, prepared to lead the 82nd Airborne Division into battle. His 3 parachute infantry regiments, the 505th, 507th, and 508th, faced an even more critical mission. Capture the town of St-Timur-Église, seize bridges over the Murderette and Douve rivers, and establish a defensive line to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Gavin had already jumped into combat in Sicily and Italy. He knew what awaited them in the darkness over France. What none of them knew was that the elaborate plan, refined through months of preparation and rehearsal, would collapse within minutes of crossing the French coast. The drop zones, carefully selected based on aerial reconnaissance and resistance intelligence, would prove nearly impossible to hit. The aircraft formations, designed to ensure concentrated landings, would shatter under German anti-aircraft fire. And from that chaos, from that complete breakdown of military order, would emerge one of the most remarkable improvisations in warfare history. The C-47s began taking off at 2,300 hours, forming into massive aerial trains that stretched across the night sky. Each aircraft carried 18 paratroopers, called a stick in airborne terminology. The planes flew in tight V formations of 3. These Vs organized into serials of 36 to 45 aircraft each. By midnight, over 800 C-47s were airborne, carrying 13,400 men from the 101st and 6,600 from the 82nd toward Normandy. Behind them came another wave of gliders carrying jeeps, artillery, and additional troops. The aerial armada represented 2 years of American airborne doctrine development, billions of dollars of investment, and the hopes of Allied high command. Inside the aircraft, the paratroopers sat in silence or shouted conversations over the engine roar. Some prayed. Others checked their equipment for the 10th time. A few tried to sleep. Private John Steele of the 505th PIR wrote in his diary during the flight, "Scared doesn't begin to describe it, but scared in a way that sharpens everything. I can hear my own heartbeat over the engines. I can taste the metal of my rifle. I know I might die tonight, but I also know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The channel crossing took 90 minutes. The night was clear, stars visible above, the water below reflecting moonlight. It seemed peaceful, almost surreal. Then, at 0115 hours on June 6th, the Pathfinder aircraft carrying advance teams crossed the Normandy coast near the Cotentin Peninsula. Within seconds, the sky exploded. German flak batteries had been waiting. Rommel's Atlantic Wall defenses included concentrated anti-aircraft positions, specifically positioned to defend against airborne assault. The 88mm and 105mm guns opened fire, filling the sky with exploding shells. Tracer rounds created luminous spider webs of death. The tight aircraft formations that looked so impressive over England became death traps over France. C-47 pilots, most of them in combat for the first time, reacted instinctively. They climbed, dove, accelerated, broke formation. Anything to escape the flak. The carefully planned drop zones became irrelevant. Some pilots dropped their paratroopers at 300 feet instead of the planned 600, giving men barely enough time for their chutes to open. Others climbed to 2,000 feet, causing paratroopers to scatter across miles of countryside. Aircraft speed varied from 110 miles per hour to over 150, affecting how far jumpers would drift from the drop point. Inside the aircraft, the paratroopers experienced hell. Flak tore through aluminum fuselages. Men were wounded before they could jump. Equipment caught fire. The red light stayed on, standby, as pilots desperately tried to locate drop zones they couldn't find in the darkness and smoke. When the green light finally illuminated, go, the paratroopers rushed toward the door, desperate to escape the flying death trap regardless of what waited below. Lieutenant Winters jumped at 1:45 hours into complete darkness. The ground appeared faster than he expected. His aircraft had dropped them at barely 400 feet. He hit hard in a hedgerow, his parachute tangling in the dense vegetation. Cutting himself free, Winters discovered he was alone. No sound of his aircraft or others. No sight of fellow paratroopers. Just the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions. He had trained for many contingencies, but not this, being completely isolated miles behind enemy lines with no idea where his unit, his objective, or even the landing beaches were located. The reality facing American paratroopers that night defied belief. Of the 6,600 men from the 82nd Airborne, only 1,100 landed in or near their designated drop zones. The remaining 5,500 were scattered across a 225-square-mile area. Some landed 15 miles from their objectives. Others came down in the flooded marshlands that Rommel had deliberately created by damming local rivers. Weighted down with equipment, unable to see in the darkness, hundreds drowned in water only 4 feet deep. The 101st fared no better. Entire companies were dispersed across the countryside. Some sticks landed so far off course they didn't make contact with American forces for days. The 506th PIR, supposedly the most accurately dropped regiment, still had men scattered across 12 miles. The carefully crafted plan, company objectives, battalion coordination, regimental operations dissolved into chaos. But the chaos cut both ways. At German 84th Corps headquarters in Est-Thilot, telephone reports flooded in throughout the night, each more confusing than the last. American paratroopers spotted near Corentin. Americans at St-Mireglise. Americans northwest of Volognes. Americans inland at Pikovo. Americans everywhere. General Lieutenant Erich Marx, commanding the corps responsible for defending the Cotentin Peninsula, stared at the map in growing alarm. The invasion he'd been expecting was happening, but nothing made sense. Why would the Americans drop airborne forces so dispersed? What was their objective? How many were there? Marx couldn't know, that the American High Command was asking the same questions. The dispersal wasn't strategy. It was catastrophe. But to German intelligence officers trained to interpret enemy actions as deliberate tactical moves, the scattered drops suggested an invasion force 3 times larger than reality. They saw coordination where there was only confusion, strategic deployment where there was only desperate improvisation. The psychological impact on German units was immediate and profound. Isolated sentries heard movement in the darkness, called out challenges, received American curses or cricket clicker responses, and were shot or stabbed before they could raise an alarm. Communication lines were cut, apparently systematically, though in reality by individual paratroopers who stumbled upon them. Convoy routes were ambushed, not by planned operations, but by small groups of lost Americans attacking targets of opportunity. Oberst Ludwig Heilmann, commanding the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment positioned to counterattack any airborne landing, received orders to move toward St-Mireglise at 0230 hours. His march, which should have taken 2 hours, required 9. Every kilometer brought new reports. Americans ahead, Americans on the flanks, Americans behind. Heilmann's regiment, one of Germany's best, spent the night hunting shadows while the real threat solidified positions they would have overwhelmed had they arrived on schedule. At St-Mireglise, the first act of the paratrooper drama reached its climax. The town, a critical crossroads on Route N13 connecting Cherbourg to Corentin, was garrisoned by elements of the 91st Luftland Division. Shortly after midnight, a fire broke out in a building on the town square. Local French civilians and German soldiers formed bucket brigades to fight it. Church bells rang the alarm, bringing the entire town into the streets. At precisely 0130 hours, C-47s carrying the 3rd Battalion, 505th PIR roared overhead and green lights flashed. Paratroopers began dropping directly onto the illuminated town square. Some later called it the most surreal experience of their lives. Floating down toward enemy soldiers clearly visible in the firelight, unable to maneuver, completely exposed. The Germans reacted quickly. Machine guns opened fire. Paratroopers were shot in their harnesses, some before their chutes fully opened. Bodies hung from trees and telephone poles around the square. Private John Steele's parachute snagged on the church steeple, leaving him dangling directly above the square. A German bullet grazed his foot. Another punctured his parachute. He played dead, hanging there for over 2 hours while the battle raged below, praying no one would look up and finish him. Germans would eventually capture him, though he'd escaped the next day during an American attack. But while Germans focused on the visible threat in the town square, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss was rallying survivors in the darkness outside town. Krauss, nicknamed Cannonball for his stocky build and aggressive tactics, gathered about 180 men from various units. Less than half his battalion's strength, but enough. At 0430 hours, they attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. The Germans, still disoriented by continuing paratrooper landings and believing themselves surrounded by superior forces, broke and retreated. By 0500 hours, Krauss stood in the town square and raised an American flag on the church, the same church where Steele still hung. It was the first American flag to fly over liberated French territory. The propaganda value was immense, but the tactical value was greater. Route N13 was cut. German reinforcements from Cherbourg would have to detour, costing critical hours. 6 miles southeast, a different drama unfolded at La Fere Bridge. This stone bridge crossing the Murderette River was critical. It provided the only dry route through miles of marshland Rommel had flooded. Losing it would strand American forces. Holding it would split German defensive positions. The plan called for the 507th PIR to capture the bridge in a coordinated assault. Instead, scattered groups from multiple units stumbled toward it independently. Captain Ben Schwarzwalder arrived with 15 men from the 507th at 0345 hours to find the bridge undefended. It seemed too good to be true. It was. At dawn, German forces counterattacked with armor and infantry from the 1057th Grenadier Regiment. Schwarzwalder's tiny force, reinforced to perhaps 60 men from various scattered units, faced German forces estimated at over 500 with tank support. The battle that followed would last 3 days. The Americans, positioned in buildings and hedgerows on the western side of the bridge, held against repeated German assaults through individual acts of courage that defied military logic. Private Marcus Heim, a clerk who'd never fired his weapon in combat, held an exposed position for 6 hours, killing or wounding an estimated 20 Germans before being shot through both legs. He continued firing from a prone position until medics forcibly evacuated him. Sergeant William Owens, armed with a Browning automatic rifle, broke up 3 German attacks single-handedly before a mortar round killed him. The bridge held not through superior tactics or firepower, but through desperate men refusing to retreat. The most tactically significant action of June 6th occurred at Brecourt Manor, though it would remain largely unknown for decades. Lieutenant Richard Winters, after spending hours gathering scattered Easy Company soldiers using cricket clickers and whispered passwords, had assembled about 45 men by dawn. He reported to battalion headquarters expecting orders to move toward the beaches. Instead, he received an urgent mission: destroy a German artillery battery firing directly onto Utah Beach. Brecourt Manor housed 4 105mm howitzers positioned in an orchard behind the main building. The guns were protected by machine gun nests, communication trenches, and approximately 50 German soldiers. Winter's force was outnumbered, exhausted from the jump, low on ammunition, and had no heavy weapons support. Standard doctrine required at least a full company with artillery support to assault a fortified position. Winters had 13 men. That's how many he took forward, leaving the rest in reserve. What followed became the textbook example of small unit tactics. Winters split his tiny force into 2 elements, an assault team and a base of fire. He personally led the assault team in flanking maneuvers, while the base element suppressed German positions. They captured the first gun by throwing grenades into the crew position and following with rifle fire. The second gun fell to the same tactic. Germans in the communication trenches tried to reinforce, but were caught in crossfire. The third gun required Private John McGrath to charge a machine gun position alone to create an opening. He was wounded but survived. The fourth gun was destroyed with thermite grenades. The entire action lasted less than 2 hours. American casualties: 4 wounded, none killed. German casualties: approximately 15 dead, 12 wounded, 20 captured. For artillery pieces destroyed that had been firing on Utah Beach at a rate of 1 shell every 30 seconds. The action at Brecourt Manor would be studied at West Point for generations as a masterclass in leadership, tactics, and aggressive action against superior numbers. But at the time, it was just one of hundreds of small, desperate fights happening across the Normandy countryside. By noon on June 6th, the full scope of the airborne chaos became clear to commanders on both sides. For the Americans, the news was devastating. 2,582nd Airborne casualties in the first 33 hours, 1,240 from the 101st. Entire units remained missing. Equipment was lost or scattered. Many objectives remained unsecured. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st, famously remarked, "Never have so few been commanded by so many." He'd gathered only 1,100 of his 6,600 men by mid-morning. But the strategic picture told a different story. Every causeway exit from Utah Beach was secured or being contested. German reinforcements were delayed or stopped entirely. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, Germany's elite airborne counterlanding force, had been neutralized without achieving any of its objectives. The 91st Luftland Division was scattered and ineffective. Most critically, German high command remained confused about American strength and intentions, delaying critical decisions about committing armored reserves. At 1,200 hours, forward elements of the 4th Infantry Division, pushing inland from Utah Beach, made contact with paratroopers at Popeville. The link-up marked the beginning of the end of isolation. But for thousands of scattered paratroopers, the fight continued in isolation. Small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, held crossroads, ambushed convoys, cut communications, and created the impression of American forces everywhere. A captured German intelligence officer, interrogated on June 7th, provided insight into the enemy perspective. "We knew the invasion was coming. We were prepared for paratroopers. What we were not prepared for was paratroopers everywhere and nowhere. Every shadow could be American. Every hedgerow could hide an ambush. We received reports of American forces in 20 different locations simultaneously. It was impossible, but it was happening. We thought we were fighting an army. We were fighting ghosts." That quote captured the accidental genius of the scattered drop. The Germans, trained to expect concentrated military operations following doctrine and logic, faced something they'd never encountered. Thousands of individual soldiers, trained to think independently, improvising victory from disaster. The American airborne training philosophy emphasized individual initiative. When sergeants and lieutenants found themselves alone, or with small groups, they didn't wait for orders. They attacked targets of opportunity, created ad hoc units, and made command decisions normally reserved for colonels. Sergeant Leonard Funk of the 508th PIR exemplified this approach. Landing miles off target with only 3 other men, Funk spent June 6th moving toward where he thought his unit should be. Along the way, his group ambushed a German staff car, killed 2 officers, captured documents that identified enemy positions, and delivered this intelligence to the first American unit they encountered. Funk's actions, multiplied across thousands of paratroopers, created an intelligence windfall that made the scattered drops partially worthwhile. The human cost, however, was staggering. The flooded areas Rommel created claimed hundreds of lives. Paratroopers weighted with equipment landed in water they couldn't see in the darkness. Many drowned within sight of help, their screams masked by gunfire and explosions. Others landed in trees and were shot before they could cut themselves free. Some broke legs, ankles, or backs in hard landings and lay helpless as German patrols found them. Private Burton Pat Christensen of the 502nd PIR landed in deep water in the flooded area near Les Forges. His equipment dragged him under immediately. He managed to release his reserve chute, but couldn't reach the quick release for his main chute. Underwater, in complete darkness, with his lungs burning, Christensen performed an act of desperate ingenuity. He inflated his life vest, which gave him just enough buoyancy to get his head above water for one breath. That single breath gave him the seconds he needed to find and release his main chute. He survived. The paratrooper who landed 30 feet away from him did not. The stories of survival were matched by stories of extraordinary courage. Captain Charles Shettle, a dentist in civilian life, led a mixed group of 82nd and 101st paratroopers in capturing the La Barquette locks on the Douve River, a critical objective that prevented Germans from flooding additional areas. Shettle's force, cobbled together from scattered jumpers who'd never met before that night, held the locks against repeated counterattacks for 36 hours despite being outnumbered and nearly surrounded. By June 8th, the scattered paratroopers had largely been consolidated into functioning units. The beach landings had succeeded beyond initial expectations, partly because German reinforcements never arrived in strength. Rommel, rushing back from Germany where he'd been celebrating his wife's birthday, reached his headquarters to discover that the critical first hours, the period when armor reserves could have driven the invasion back into the sea, had been wasted in confusion and misdirection. The post-battle analysis conducted by Allied headquarters revealed uncomfortable truths. The airborne operation had achieved its objectives, but not through planning or execution. It succeeded through individual initiative, enemy confusion, and luck. If the Germans had recognized the scattered drops as weakness rather than strength, if they'd maintained calm and deployed reserves decisively, the outcome could have been catastrophic. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, privately questioned whether airborne operations remained viable. The casualty rate was too high, the execution too chaotic. The British, who'd conducted their own airborne operation on the eastern flank of the invasion with more concentrated drops and higher casualties, shared these doubts. But the paratroopers themselves told a different story. Major Dick Winters, promoted after Brecourt Manor, later reflected, "We trained for 2 years to execute a perfect jump and rally on objectives within minutes. Instead, we were scattered like seeds in a storm. But that training also taught us to think, to lead, to improvise. When the plan died in the first minutes, we didn't panic. We adapted. Every NCO became a platoon leader. Every lieutenant commanded a company. We created units based on who was there, not what the table of organization said. That's why we won." The Germans drew different lessons. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of operations for the Wehrmacht High Command, wrote in his diary, "The American airborne operation was a catastrophe that became a victory through our mistakes. We had prepared for concentrated landings at known drop zones. Instead, they were everywhere. Our response was paralyzed by confusion. We saw coordination where there was chaos. We attributed strategy to what was accident. By the time we understood what had actually happened, it was too late. The beaches were secure. The legacy of the D-Day airborne operation remains complex. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions became legendary, their jump boots and distinctive patches symbols of elite status. The scattered drops entered military folklore as examples of American adaptability and initiative. West Point and military schools worldwide studied the operation, though they drew different conclusions about what it proved. The human legacy was carried by the survivors. Men who jumped into darkness over France formed bonds that transcended normal military camaraderie. They'd survived not just combat, but chaos. They'd improvised victory when defeat seemed certain. They'd proven that training, courage, and initiative could overcome catastrophic failures of planning. Private John Steele, who hung from the St. Miraglise church steeple, returned to the town every year until his death in 1969. A mannequin still hangs from that steeple today, commemorating his ordeal. Richard Winters went on to command Easy Company through the remainder of the European campaign, his leadership immortalized in the book and miniseries Band of Brothers. Colonel James Gavin rose to command the 82nd Airborne Division and became one of America's most respected military leaders. But thousands of others remain unknown. The paratroopers who drowned in flooded fields, the ones shot in their harnesses, the small groups that fought and died in Norman hedgerows without anyone recording their names. The scattered drops that saved the invasion also scattered the credit across so many individual acts of courage that no single story could capture them all. The question that haunts historians remains unanswerable. What if the drops had been concentrated as planned? Would a massed airborne force have been more effective, or would it have been destroyed by German reserves that could focus on a single threat? The scattered drops created confusion that paralyzed German response, but at a terrible cost in lives and unit cohesion. Success came not from what was planned, but from what was improvised in the darkness by men who refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. June 6, 1944 proved something that military planners still struggle to quantify. That training soldiers to think independently creates resilience that perfect planning cannot match. The American paratroopers who landed scattered across Normandy weren't following a brilliant strategy. They were surviving a disaster. But they'd been trained well enough that survival became victory. The dawn they earned, the liberation of France that began with their scattered drops, came at the price of 3,740 American airborne casualties in the first 48 hours. But those casualties bought something priceless: time. Time for the beaches to be secured. Time for reinforcements to land. Time for the invasion that would end Nazi Germany's control of Europe to gain its foothold. In the end, the paratroopers who jumped into chaos over Normandy altered history not through flawless execution, but through refusing to quit when everything went wrong. They landed behind enemy lines scattered, isolated, and far from their objectives. And from that disaster, through individual courage multiplied across thousands of soldiers, they improvised a victory that no plan could have designed. That's the truth German pilots discovered about American determination. That's what the thunder of C-47 engines and the sight of parachutes filling the night sky represented. Not perfection, but unstoppable will. The sky belonged to America that night. Not because the plan worked, but because American paratroopers refused to accept that it hadn't.